The auctioneer almost didn't bother calling it. Harlan County Equipment Auction, April 14, 1987. A Tuesday morning, cold enough that men kept their hands in their pockets between bids. The lot was full of decent iron, a John Deere 4440, 2 flatbed trailers, a case backhoe with low hours. Good equipment moving for good money. Then the auctioneer reached the last item on his list, and his voice changed. "All right, folks, last lot of the day. 1952 AutoCar wrecker. Sold as is, where is, no title, no history, engine seized. She's been sitting behind the county impound since 1971. Somebody spray-painted the door. Starting bid is $100. Nobody moved. The truck sat at the far end of the lot, separated from the respectable equipment the way a sick animal gets separated from the herd. The cab was rust orange, where red paint had surrendered to 16 years of weather. The boom arm was bent at the tip. Both rear tires were flat and cracked. The winch cable had snapped and coiled around the drum like a dead snake. And across the driver's door, in white spray paint, someone had written a single word. Trashy. Come on, folks, $100 for a piece of history, parts value alone. There are no parts worth having on that thing, called out a man near the front. Laughter moved through the crowd. The man who'd spoken was Gary Trent, owner of Trent's Towing and Recovery, the biggest tow operation in Harlan County. He was 46 years old, thick through the chest, wearing clean Carhartt bibs and boots that had never seen mud. He sold new equipment. He had opinions about old equipment. That autocar's been sitting since Nixon was president, Trent said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Engines are paperweight, frames probably cracked. Whoever buys that thing is buying a headache and a tetanus shot. More laughter. $50, the auctioneer said, abandoning dignity. Give me 50. Silence. That's when Danny Collier raised his hand. He was 24 years old, standing at the back of the crowd in a green work shirt with a name patch and jeans that had seen better days. He had the build of someone who'd been doing physical labor since he was old enough to hold a wrench, and the quiet eyes of someone who didn't talk much because he'd learned that talking and doing were different things. 50, Danny said. Every head turned. Gary Trent looked at him and started laughing, not a polite chuckle, a real laugh, the kind that bends a man at the waist. Danny Collier, Trent said, boy, do you know what $50 could buy you? The truck, Danny said. That's not a truck, that's a monument to giving up. Trent gestured at the autocar. Look at it, 16 years in a yard, and it still looks worse than it did when they parked it. I can fix it. The 5 men standing near Trent exchanged glances. One of them shook his head. Another said something under his breath that made the others smile. The auctioneer, sensing momentum, called it fast. 50 going once, 50 going twice. He brought the gavel down, sold for $50 to the young man in the back. Son, you just bought yourself a genuine antique, or a boat anchor, hard to say which. Danny walked to the payment table, counted out $50 in 5s and 10s, and collected his receipt. Gary Trent intercepted him on the way out. I'll give you $100 right now, Trent said. Scrap value, save yourself the trouble. It's not for scrap. Then what's it for? Danny looked at the autocar, at the rust, and the bent boom, and the spray-painted word on the door. It's for working, he said. Trent laughed again. You're going to need more than optimism, son. That engine hasn't turned over since your mother was in grade school. Danny walked past him to the truck. Now let me tell you about Danny Collier, because you need to understand where he came from to understand why he bid on that truck. Danny was born in 1963 in Harlan County, Kentucky, the only son of Ray Collier and his wife June. Ray had run a small towing operation out of a barn on Route 119 for most of Danny's childhood, nothing fancy, a used wrecker and a flatbed, answering calls for stuck coal trucks and broken-down farm equipment. Danny had grown up in that barn. By the time he was 12, he could change a tire faster than his father. By 15, he could rebuild a carburetor from memory. By 18, he was going out on jobs alone while Ray's back problems kept him off ladders and under vehicles. Ray died in 1984 when Danny was 21. Heart attack, fast, no warning. Left Danny the barn, the tools, a 1974 International wrecker with 180,000 miles and $4,200 in debt to the Harlan County Bank. Danny paid off the debt in 18 months and kept working. But the International was dying. He could feel it, the way a man who grew up around engines can feel when something is running out of time. The transmission was slipping. The frame had a crack he'd welded twice. The engine burned a quart of oil every 3 days. He needed a truck. He didn't have money for a new one, didn't have money for a decent used one. What he had was $50 in his pocket and a belief his father had given him. Ray used to say, the worst thing a man can do is let other people tell him what's possible. Danny had those words in his head the morning of the Harlan County equipment auction. Let me tell you about the first week with the AutoCar, because that's when most people would have given up. Danny borrowed a flatbed trailer from a neighbor named Carl Hobbs and hauled the AutoCar back to his barn. It took 3 men to push it onto the trailer because the wheels wouldn't turn and the steering was frozen solid. When they finally got it inside the barn, Gary Trent's words seemed less like mockery and more like prophecy. The engine was worse than seized. 16 years of sitting had turned the oil to varnish and fused the pistons to the cylinder walls. The rings had rusted into the bores. The crankshaft wouldn't budge with a breaker bar and a 4-foot pipe. The transmission was locked up. The hydraulics were frozen solid. The electrical system was a tangle of corroded wire and crumbled insulation. And the cab wall, the metal partition between the engine bay and the interior, had been welded shut. Not factory welding, hand welding, rough beads that someone had run over the access panel that should have allowed engine maintenance from inside the cab. Danny noticed it the first night, running his flashlight over the interior. The panel was about 2 feet square, fitted flush with the cab wall but sealed tight with amateur welds. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he filed it away and focused on the engine. There were more pressing concerns. What Danny did over the next 3 months, let me tell you, was not restoration. It was resurrection. He pulled the engine completely, tore it down to bare block on a workbench covered in his father's tools. Bored the cylinders, had the crankshaft ground at a machine shop in Middlesbrough, rebuilt the head with parts he mail-ordered from a supplier in Ohio. He rebuilt the transmission on his kitchen floor on a Sunday in July, parts spread across newspaper, manual propped open with a coffee mug. He freed the hydraulics by making a pump rebuild tool from scrap steel and old motor mounts. Gary Trent drove past the barn twice that summer, saw Danny working through the open doors both times, didn't stop either time. Word got around, the way it does in small counties, that Collier Boy is still messing with that junk AutoCar. Waste of time, waste of money, gonna end in tears. Danny heard it, he kept working. On a Saturday morning in October 1987, 6 months after the auction, Danny poured fresh oil into the rebuilt engine, primed the carburetor, and climbed into the cab. His hand was shaking on the starter button. He pushed it. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times, coughed, caught, died. He waited 30 seconds, tried again. This time it fired, rough at first, missing on 2 cylinders, black smoke pouring from the exhaust stack. Then, as oil circulated and the engine found its rhythm, it smoothed. The AutoCar rumbled to life for the first time since Richard Nixon was president. Danny sat in the cab and let it run. He didn't whoop or holler. He just sat there with his hands on the wheel, listening to the engine. His father had always told him you could fix anything if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and willing to do the work. 3 days later, his first call came in. A logging truck off the road on Black Creek Road, stuck in a ditch deep enough that the cab was tilting sideways. 2 other companies had looked at it and declined. Danny drove the autocar out of the barn for the first time and went to work. It took him 4 hours, but he got it out. The logging company foreman, a man named Hector Davis, watched the whole operation. When it was done, he walked over to where Danny was coiling chain. "How old's that wrecker?" "35 years. Runs like it's 10. She needed some work." Hector Davis looked at the autocar for a long time. "I've got 12 trucks running these roads. I want your number." That was how it started. For 19 years, Danny Collier ran Collier Recovery out of that barn on Route 119 with the 1952 autocar as his primary truck. He bought a second truck in 1993, a third in 1998, hired 2 employees, got the contracts for 3 coal companies and a logging operation. Gary Trent's company lost customers to him steadily through the 90s. By 2001, Trent's Towing had sold off half its fleet. Danny never said a word about it. He just worked. The autocar worked with him. Every job, every season. Summer heat, winter ice, spring mud that could swallow an axle. The old truck never refused a call. But the welded cab wall stayed welded. Danny had looked at it 100 times over the years, thought about cutting it open, but there was always another job, always something more pressing. The truck ran fine without opening the panel. Whatever was behind that wall could wait. It waited 19 years. The morning of March 8, 2006, Danny was doing annual maintenance on the autocar. New gaskets, fresh oil, brake adjustment. Standard stuff he did every spring before the mud season hit. He was inside the cab, checking the steering column, when his flashlight caught the welded panel again. He sat there looking at it. His father had been gone 22 years. The barn had changed, the equipment had changed, the county had changed. But this panel was exactly as it had been in 1987. Same rough welds, same deliberate sealing. Someone had put something behind that wall. And Danny had waited long enough. He got the angle grinder. It took him 40 minutes to cut through the welds carefully, preserving the panel edges. When he finally pried the panel free, a smell hit him, old metal and something drier, like paper that hadn't seen air in decades. He shined his flashlight into the cavity. The space behind the wall was about 18 inches deep, running the full width of the cab. It had been lined with sheet metal, carefully formed and sealed to keep out moisture. Someone had built this. Deliberately, carefully, a long time ago. Inside, resting on the metal shelf, were 3 things. A canvas pouch, all stained and stiff with age. A metal box, the kind used for petty cash, locked with a small padlock. And an envelope sealed with a name written on the front in handwriting Danny recognized immediately. Danny. His father's handwriting. Danny's hands went absolutely still. He reached in and lifted the envelope out. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but intact. His name in Ray's careful printing, the same handwriting that had filled out job invoices and parts orders for 20 years. He sat down on the running board and stared at it for a long time. Then he opened it. The letter was 3 pages, written on lined yellow paper, dated October 1971. Danny. You're 8 years old right now, and you don't know anything about this truck. By the time you find this, if you find this, you'll be old enough to understand. Let me tell you where this autocar came from. This truck belonged to my father, your grandfather. His name was Earl Collier, and he ran the best recovery operation in Harlan County from 1948 until the day they took everything from him. Earl built this truck from a surplus chassis he bought after the war, welded the boom himself, built the winch drum from a mining hoist, ran it for 23 years and never once refused a call. In 1969, a man named Douglas Vance wanted Earl's contracts. Vance owned 3 companies in the county and he had friends on the county commission. When Earl wouldn't sell, Vance found another way. He had Earl's operating license pulled on fabricated safety violations. He got the bank to call Earl's loans early. He spread word that Earl's equipment was dangerous and his operation was unreliable. Within a year, Earl had lost his contracts, lost his bank financing, and couldn't legally operate. In 1971, Earl had a stroke. He died 3 months later. Before he died, he told me where he'd hidden the money. Danny stopped reading. He looked at the canvas pouch. He picked it up. It was heavier than he'd expected. He loosened the drawstring and looked inside. Cash, old bills, nothing newer than 1970. Banded in groups, rubber bands rotted away, the bundles held together by the compression of being stored in a sealed space for 35 years. Danny counted it twice. $11,400. He went back to the letter. Earl had been saving for 20 years. Cash, kept out of the bank because he didn't trust banks after what Vance did. He hid it in the truck because he said a man's savings should be in something he could see and touch and trust. After he died, Vance tried to seize the equipment as payment for a debt I don't believe Earl ever owed. I hid the truck at Carl Hobbs's property before Vance's men could get to it. Told Carl to let it sit and not tell anyone. I sealed the money in the cab wall before I hid the truck. Figured if something happened to me before I could deal with Vance, at least the money would stay safe. I'm writing this in October 1971. You're 8 years old. I don't know when you'll find this or if you'll find it at all. But if you're reading this, you found the truck and you got it running because that's the kind of boy you are. The metal box has documents, Earl's original operating license, the contracts Vance stole, and a letter from Earl's lawyer that says what Vance did was fraud. I don't know if it's worth anything after all this time, but it's the truth, and truth is worth keeping. The money is yours. Earl saved it for the family. Use it to build something. Your grandfather was the best recovery man in this county. He built everything from nothing, and they took it from him for no reason except that he was good at what he did, and someone powerful wanted what he had. Don't sell this truck. Don't let anyone tell you it's worthless. Your grandfather built it with his own hands, and it carries his name even if nobody can see it. I love you, son. Dad. Danny sat on the running board for a long time. The barn was quiet around him. Morning light came through the gap in the doors. The AutoCar's engine ticked as it cooled from the earlier warm-up. He was 43 years old. He'd been running this truck for 19 years without knowing whose hands had built it, without knowing that the reason it was abandoned in an impound lot for 16 years was because a corrupt man had stolen his grandfather's business and left the truck to rot. He opened the metal box with a bent nail, the padlock long since rusted open. Inside were the documents his father had described: Earl's operating license, dated 1948, 3 contract documents from coal companies, signed and stamped, and a 4-page letter from a lawyer in Harlan detailing the fabricated violations and the bank manipulation. Douglas Vance had died in 1989, but his son, Richard Vance, ran the family's companies now. Danny read the lawyer's letter twice, then he made a phone call. The attorney he reached was a woman named Carol Stearns, who specialized in business fraud cases. How old is the documentation? She asked. 1971. And you have original contracts and an attorney's letter from the time? Yes. What are you looking for? Criminal charges won't stick at this point. The statute of limitations. I'm not looking for criminal charges, Danny said. I'm looking for the record to show what happened. My grandfather built something and someone took it. I want it on record that it was taken wrong. Carol Stearns was quiet for a moment. I can file a civil claim for fraud against the Vance estate. It won't result in a large judgment at this distance, but it would establish the documented record. That's enough. The case took 8 months. Richard Vance's lawyers fought it, but the original documents were clear, and a retired judge who'd been a young attorney in 1971 testified that he remembered the Vance manipulation of Earl Collier's license. The judgment was modest, $28,000, reflecting documented lost contracts from 1969 to 1971. Danny donated it to the Harlan County Mechanics Trade School in Earl Collier's name. The day after the judgment, Gary Trent drove out to the barn on Route 119. Danny was working on the AutoCar when Trent walked in. Trent was older now, 65, slower. He stood in the barn doorway looking at the truck. "I heard about your grandfather," Trent said, "and what Vance did." "Yep. I knew Douglas Vance, bought equipment from him." Trent paused. "I didn't know what he did to your family." Danny kept working. "I laughed at you in 1987, Trent said, "called your truck trash, said you were throwing good money after bad." "You did." "I was wrong." Danny set down his wrench and looked at the man who'd laughed at him in a gravel lot 19 years ago. "Yes," Danny said, "you were." Trent stood there for a moment. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back to his truck. Danny watched him go. Then he turned back to the AutoCar and kept working. That night, Danny sat in the barn with the letter and the documents spread on his workbench. He read his father's words again in the lamplight. "Don't sell this truck. Don't let anyone tell you it's worthless. Your grandfather built it with his own hands." Earl Collier had built the AutoCar from scrap in 1948, had run it for 23 years before Douglas Vance took his business, had hidden his savings inside it before he died, trusting that someone in his family would find the truck someday. Ray had hidden the truck and written the letter, had trusted that Danny would find it. Danny had paid $50 for a truck that everyone called trash, fixed it with patience and stubbornness, and run it for 19 years without knowing he was driving his grandfather's legacy. He thought about that for a long time. Then he picked up a paint brush and a can of red paint and walked to the AutoCar's door. He painted over the word trash carefully, covering every letter. In its place, in the same style as the original lettering that had faded to ghost marks on the door, he painted 3 words. Collier Heavy Recovery. His grandfather's name. His father's name. His name. The AutoCar is still running. Danny is 61 now, and his son Marcus, named for no one in particular, just a name they liked, runs the day-to-day operation of Collier Recovery. 3 trucks, 4 employees, the best reputation in the county. But the 1952 AutoCar stays in the barn. Danny starts it once a month, lets it warm up, listens to the engine, checks the fluids. Sometimes Marcus asks why he keeps it. Danny always gives the same answer. Because your great-grandfather built it, and the worst thing a man can do is let other people tell him what's possible. Earl Collier built a truck from scrap in a barn in Harlan County in 1948. 78 years later, it's still there. Still running. Still carrying the name.